Audacious bubbles, the secret ingredient in innovation success. Now, this is a good time for celebration. Quite apart from a raft of family birthdays to commemorate, we also had the good news that our book, The Scaling Value Playbook, has won an award for Best Book to Help SME Growth. Now, it doesn't take much to nudge me towards the fridge, to open a bottle, and to raise a toast to innovation. And appropriately enough, the bottle which came to hand had a distinctive yellow label. Because if I were to choose a themed brand of champagne, this would be the one for innovation. Because apart from the delightful prickle and lift of the liquid itself, Veuve Cliquot champagne also has a fascinating innovation story to tell. It's been around a long time. The vineyards from which it emanates were originally established back in 1772, when Philippe Cliquot, a successful textile maker, decided to indulge in winemaking as a bit of a hobby, turning some small plots of land which he owned in Ambonnay and Bouzet to the purpose. This was certainly not a case of being in the right place at the right time, an aristocratic tradition of great wine. Instead, it's a classic story of entrepreneurial grit, a passion for something and the willingness to persevere when things don't go quite according to plan. And central to it all was a remarkable woman, Barbe-Nicole Ponsardin. She was born in Reims in 1777 to another family whose business was in the textile trade. Her future, insofar as any woman at that time had a future outside of marriage, lay in the further growth of that textile business. And to help that along, a marriage was engineered between Barbe-Nicole and François, son of Philippe Cliquot. Not that the matchmaking was entirely commercial in origin. The two were very much in love, and they embarked on a happy married life. They married on the 10th of June, 1798, just after the French Revolution. But Barbe-Nicole wasn't content to stay at home running the salon. She wanted to make things happen. And her interest lay beyond the world of threads and weaving. Both she and her husband were keen to try and develop the wine business which father-in-law Philippe had established. She had some insight into that world. Her own grandmother had been involved in winemaking and had given her a glimpse of something that she wanted to explore further. So the couple approached Philippe, who was less than enthusiastic. From a business venture point of view, this was not a particularly promising prospect. Production was small but steady. It ranged from between 4,000 to 6,000 bottles every year, mostly for local French consumption. And the possibilities of expanding that market at a time when the Napoleonic Wars were just beginning to reshape the European map were not exactly what you might call rosé. But he gave them their head, letting them relaunch the business under the name Cliquot, Biron et Fils. Their early years seemed to bear out his misgivings, and the business languished. But they continued putting considerable effort into the marketing, and they recruited another partner, Louis Byrne, who helped extend their sales network with some traveling salesmen who moved across Europe where they could, promoting their wine. And production grew gradually from 8,000 bottles a year in 1796 to 60,000 in 1804. The couple also focused the output on the primary product, champagne. And by 1805, thanks in no small measure to Louis's efforts, they doubled to 110,000 bottles, an increasing number of which were being sold in the Russian market. Champagne wasn't widely drunk, but the sweet version which they produced seemed to be a particularly good match for Russian taste buds. But then tragedy struck. François died of a fever suddenly in 1805, leaving the business in the hands of his widow. Her father-in-law Philippe was devastated by his son's death and wanted to close down the entire business and sell up. But instead, Barbe-Nicole approached him with an alternative proposition. She asked him to invest the money, which would have been her inheritance, into the business. Now, like many an investor since, he saw the potential in the person. With her passion and determination, there might be a possibility. He agreed, but imposed an important condition. If she was serious, then she needed to really understand the wine trade, from growing the grapes, harvesting and processing, right through to marketing and distribution. They arranged for her to work with an experienced and a successful winemaker, a man called Alexandre Fourneau. And she spent 4 years in this kind of apprenticeship, acquiring key craft knowledge with which to grow the still struggling business. By 1810, she was able to launch her own company, Veuve Cliquot Ponsardin, Widow Cliquot, Veuve Cliquot. And this was a significant departure from the norms of French society. By law, women could do almost nothing without the permission of fathers or husbands. The only exception to this effective block on working or studying was granted to widows, who were allowed to run their own businesses, a role which Barbe-Nicole embraced, becoming one of the first businesswomen in France. Now, it would be nice to think of this story as having, in the end, a happy ending. Instead, the business continued to struggle, to the point where she was forced once again to approach her father-in-law, asking for further investment. And once again, swayed by her determination, he agreed. The challenge her business faced was particularly one of market uncertainty and political turbulence. Their early sales success had depended on stability and free movement of goods, conditions which were seriously compromised by the arrival of the Napoleonic Wars. Naval blockades prevented exports, and then her big growth hope, the Russian market, was effectively closed off by a decree issued by Tsar Alexander I banning all French products. So far from hauling the company up to success, she was staring down the barrel of its complete failure. Faced with that prospect, she started working on an audacious gamble. On the assumption that the wars would eventually cease, she prepared for re-entry to the Russian market as soon as some kind of peace emerged. On the one hand, she knows that the Russians have a particular fondness for her type of champagne, very sweet by today's standards, but popular then. And the winemaker in her knew that the 1811 vintage was really something special, even if it was currently languishing in her cellars rather than being sold and drunk. On the other hand, she's betting on the fact that sooner or later the naval blockade and the disruption to shipping will end. So she needs a ship ready to sail to Russia to carry her bottles, preferably well ahead of any competitors. With Louis Byrne, she developed a classic entrepreneurial strategy. They smuggled her champagne out of France to the Netherlands, where it was held in readiness in a cellar in Amsterdam. And they then played a long waiting game. But as the war turned against Napoleon, the blockades began to be lifted. So in 1814, they were able to seize their moment. They chartered a Dutch ship, the Zeebrugge, headed for Kongsberg, and loaded it with 10,000 bottles of champagne. It arrived just in time to be welcomed by Russian port officials as the ban on French imports had just been lifted. That shipment sold out fast and was quickly followed with another carrying 12,000 bottles to St. Petersburg. And one of the lucky recipients there was the Grand Duke Michael Pavlovich, brother to the Tsar. His endorsement of the champagne as being the only kind he would drink helped spread the word. More important, helped influence the buying preferences of the court and aristocracy. And with Napoleon finally defeated in 1815 and the monarchy restored, all over Europe the corks were coming out of bottles to celebrate. Not least in Rheims, where Barbe-Nicole could finally enjoy the success which came from having pulled off her gamble, and stolen a considerable march on the old established champagne houses like Moet by many weeks. Now, innovation is all about opportunity. And whilst the occasional bing bright idea might arrive whilst in the shower or the bath, most entrepreneurs recognize the need to go out looking for them. The challenge is to make sure you explore all the innovation space, recognizing that there are many roads to travel. Joseph Schumpeter, the godfather of innovation studies, suggested that there were 5 types of innovation to look at: product innovation, process, market, using new materials or resources, and deploying new forms of organization. Peter Drucker saw possibilities emerging from 7 sources, including unexpected incongruities, process needs, industry and market changes, demographic changes, changes in perception, and new knowledge. By the 21st century, we have models which identify many more, such as the influential Dublin consulting approach, which sees 10 types of innovation. Now, the number doesn't matter. What is important is to recognize that smart entrepreneurs look and operate in multiple directions. Now, we've used a simple 4 Ps approach in our work, one which maps out the space for innovation in 4 directions, much like a compass does in geography. So entrepreneurs can explore a product or service innovation, so that's changes in what we offer the world, incrementally doing what we do better, and occasionally radically doing something different, something the world perhaps has never seen before. But we can change what we offer. We can change our process innovation, changing the ways we create and deliver our offerings, again, incrementally or radically. We can also do what's called position innovation, changing the context in which we place things, for example, by exploring new markets, or changing the story we tell about our offering, changing the narrative. And finally, there's what we call paradigm innovation, essentially changing the underlying model, the name of the game. These days, we'd call this business model innovation. Now, Barbe-Nicole wasn't lucky enough to have access to our textbook, or indeed any of the body of knowledge around innovation which we have today. But she did understand the need to work in multiple directions to build a business based on innovation. And she did so very successfully. Mapped onto our 4 Ps model, her innovation journey included product innovation. She certainly incrementally improved the range and the quality of the wine she was making, not least by drawing on the growing first-hand experience she gained learning the trade. And that helped her offer new blends and styles, including becoming the first winemaker to offer a premium vintage product. The first was launched in 1810, and in 1811, thanks to an exceptionally good harvest, she made the Comet vintage, which was named after the rather auspicious passage overhead of a trail of stellar debris. She also pioneered the development of rosé champagne, introducing that in 1818. And there she replaced the elderberry juice with which champagne had traditionally been tinted by mixing it with still red wine, the method which is still used today. She also worked hard at process innovation, particularly reworking the production process, systematically focusing on key bottlenecks and devising solutions to help eliminate waste, in ways which would make today's practitioners of lean thinking be quite impressed. And one of her biggest breakthroughs was the invention of an alternative process for clarifying the wine. Champagne and other sparkling wines get that sparkle from continuing fermentation in the bottle. And the good side of that is that the bubbles remain. The downside is that all the dead yeast and other waste products from the fermentation also remain, and they settle into a sediment at the bottom of the bottle, which somewhat spoils the taste of the drink and makes it very cloudy. So winemakers have developed various approaches to clearing it, mostly involving tipping the wine from bottle to bottle, a long and laborious stage which, while it removed the cloudiness, also risks spoiling the taste because of the constant agitation of the wine. Barbe-Nicole's brainwave was to develop an angled rack in which bottles could be placed with their necks down so that the sediment collected near the top of the bottle. And then by carefully turning the bottles a little each day in the rack, the sediment could be concentrated and then easily poured off, leaving the rest of the contents clear and drinkable. This alternative method, which is known as riddling, is still used today. At the time, it revolutionized production by cutting time and improving quality. It paved the way for large-scale production, which was something she needed if the company was going to keep up with growing demand from an increasingly global market. It was particularly important as a way of getting competitive edge. While other champagne houses tried to discover and master the technique, it was a closely guarded secret. And it remained so in part because of her, for her time, advanced human resource practices. By paying her workers well and ensuring good conditions, she was able to secure considerable loyalty from her workforce so they didn't give away the secret. She also mastered position innovation. As we've seen, her entrepreneurial journey began by opening up new European markets, and she was quick on her feet to spot and then exploit the Russian opportunity. She also understood the powerful message that diffusion of innovation is a social process, one in which key opinion leaders can play an important accelerating role. It didn't hurt that she was able to secure the endorsement of the Tsar's brother as one of the first recorded examples of what today we'd call an influencer on social media. Her process innovations enabled high-volume production, which in turn allowed her to extend the boundaries of marketing. By the time of her death in 1866, Veuve Cliquot was well established as one of the world's first global brands. Sales grew consistently. In the 1840s, volume was around 300,000 bottles a year. By 1850, this had grown to 400,000, and in 1866, they'd reached 750,000 bottles. And with that came the chance to reposition champagne in people's minds, moving it from being a specialist, niche, luxury item enjoyed only by the wealthy to become the drink of choice for celebration amongst a growing middle class round the world. Her successors carried on this tradition of position innovation, not least in changing the product name and the label to use an eye-catching yellow with the designation Veuve Cliquot Ponsardin, acknowledging that key role that the widow Cliquot had played. And lastly, she understood paradigm innovation. All those changes I've just talked about not only helped change the way the wine industry worked in terms of its global business model, but it also demonstrates how a company can rethink itself through systematic application of knowledge. In some ways, hers was one of the early knowledge-based businesses. But perhaps the biggest legacy in terms of paradigm innovation was the example she herself set, rethinking the role which women could play in the world of business, and demonstrating that the key skills of entrepreneurial thought and action weren't solely the province of men. She's often been called the first businesswoman of Europe, and the fact that the business she founded has continued to thrive and is now the second most popular brand of champagne in the world, selling close to 1.5 million cases each year, suggests it wasn't a worthless epithet. She shared her passion for empowering other women in particular, and entrepreneurs in general. And perhaps one of the best testaments to her thinking comes from a letter she once wrote to a grandchild, in which she suggested that the world is in perpetual motion, and we must invent the things of tomorrow. One must go before others, be determined and exacting. and let your intelligence direct your life. Act with audacity. Drink to that.